The autumn winds of 897 AD howled across the Saxon settlement of Whitmore like the breath of angry gods. Rain lashed against the thatched roofs of modest wooden homes, while smoke from dying hearth fires was swallowed by the tempest. Young Aldrich huddled beneath a makeshift shelter of rotting planks and torn cloth, his thin frame shaking with cold and hunger. At 12 years old, he had already learned the harsh lesson that mercy was as rare as gold in these troubled lands. The boy pressed his back against the stone wall of what had once been the village blacksmith's forge, now abandoned since his father's death 3 moons prior. His mother had perished the winter before from fever, leaving him to fend for himself in a world that showed little compassion to orphans. The other villagers, struggling with their own survival, had gradually closed their doors to him. Father Dunstan, the local priest, offered prayers but little else, claiming the monastery's stores were already stretched thin, feeding their own. As lightning split the dark sky, illuminating the muddy paths between homes, Aldrich caught sight of a massive figure moving through the storm. The stranger walked with purpose, despite the driving rain, his long hair whipping in the wind like battle banners. Even from a distance, the boy could see this was no ordinary traveler. The man's broad shoulders carried a great axe, its metal head gleaming wetly in the intermittent flashes of lightning. Thick furs draped his frame, and his beard, dark as a raven's wing, was braided with small bones and metal rings. This was a Viking, one of the Norse raiders who had terrorized Saxon lands for generations. Aldrich's heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. Every child in Whitmore had heard the stories whispered by firelight, tales of berserkers who fought with the fury of wolves, who showed no mercy to Christian souls, who took children as slaves across the northern seas. Yet something stayed the boy's flight. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or maybe the strange calm in the giant's movements, but Aldrich remained frozen in his hiding place as the warrior approached. The Viking's eyes, pale as winter ice, swept across the settlement with the methodical gaze of a hunter. When those eyes found Aldrich's shelter, the boy was certain his short life was over. "Boy," the stranger called out in heavily accented Saxon, his voice carrying easily over the storm's roar. "Come here." Aldrich's legs trembled, but he found himself unable to move. The Viking stepped closer, water streaming from his beard and furs. Up close, he was even more imposing, easily 7 feet tall, with scars crisscrossing his massive arms like a map of old battles. A silver hammer pendant hung from his neck, marking him as a devotee of Thor. "I said, come here, child. I will not harm you." The warrior's tone was surprisingly gentle, though it still carried the authority of one accustomed to being obeyed. Slowly, Aldrich emerged from his shelter, his bare feet squelching in the mud. The Viking studied him with those unsettling pale eyes, taking in the boy's hollow cheeks, his clothes that hung like rags on his thin frame, the way he swayed slightly from hunger and exhaustion. "What is your name, young Saxon?" "Aldrich, my lord," the boy stammered, using the formal address, though he doubted this pagan warrior deserved such courtesy. "I am Ragnar Ironson," the Viking replied, his hand resting casually on his axe handle. "Tell me, Aldrich, where are your parents, your family?" "Dead, my lord. The fever took my mother last winter. My father, he died when his forge collapsed 3 months past." Aldrich's voice cracked with the admission. Speaking the words aloud made his loss feel fresh and raw again. Ragnar's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "And the others in this settlement, they do not care for you." Aldrich shook his head, rainwater mixing with tears he was too proud to acknowledge. "They have their own troubles, my lord. There is little enough food for their own children." The Viking was silent for a long moment, his pale eyes studying the boy's face. Around them, the storm continued its assault on the village, but neither moved to seek better shelter. Finally, Ragnar reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something wrapped in oiled cloth. "I have traveled far today," he said, unwrapping what appeared to be a loaf of dark bread, still fragrant despite being somewhat stale. "This is all the food I carry, and I am hungry. But you—" he held the bread toward Aldrich. "You need it more than I do." Aldrich stared at the offered bread as if it were a vision. His stomach cramped with desperate hunger, but confusion warred with need. "My lord, I don't understand. You are Viking. We are enemies, are we not?" A rumbling laugh escaped Ragnar's chest. "Enemies? Perhaps our peoples have fought, boy, but you are just a child, and I am just a man far from home. In the north, we have a saying, 'Cattle die, kinsmen die, you yourself will die, but the reputation of one who has earned a good name will never die.' What kind of name would I earn by letting a child starve when I have the means to help?" Still hesitant, Aldrich reached out with trembling hands to accept the bread. The moment his fingers touched it, his restraint crumbled. He tore into the loaf with desperate hunger, cramming chunks into his mouth with no thought for dignity or manners. The bread was coarse and dark, made from rye and barley, but to the starving boy, it tasted like the finest feast. Ragnar watched without judgment, his massive frame providing some shelter from the driving rain. When Aldrich had consumed nearly half the loaf, shame finally overcame hunger, and he stopped eating. "My lord, I have taken too much. You said you were hungry as well." The Viking shook his head. "A warrior can endure hunger better than a growing boy. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "I have been in far worse situations with far less food." "But why?" Aldrich asked, clutching the remaining bread to his chest. "Why show kindness to a Saxon child? Your people and mine have shed much blood." Ragnar was quiet for a moment, his pale eyes distant, as if seeing something beyond the storm-lashed village. "I had a son once," he said finally, his voice barely audible over the wind. "About your age. He died of fever 2 winters past, while I was away raiding in Francia. When I returned—" He paused, swallowing hard. "My wife told me he had asked for me in his final moments. Asked when his father would come home." The pain in the giant's voice was unmistakable, and Aldrich felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of shared loss that transcended the enmity between their peoples. "I am sorry for your loss, my lord," the boy said quietly, "as I am for yours, young Aldrich." Ragnar straightened, seeming to shake off the weight of memory. "I cannot bring back the dead, neither my son nor your parents, but perhaps I can ensure that another child does not go hungry tonight." They stood together in comfortable silence as the storm began to show signs of weakening. The rain had eased from a torrential downpour to steady droplets, and the lightning had moved off toward the eastern horizon. Ragnar pulled his furs tighter around his broad shoulders and glanced toward the path that led out of the settlement. "I must go," he said. "My ship waits at the river mouth, and my crew will be growing restless. Will you stay the night, my lord? The innkeeper might—" "No, boy. A Viking's welcome in a Saxon village would likely be measured in sword strokes, not warm beds." Ragnar's eyes crinkled with grim humor. "Besides, I have business to attend to come morning." Aldrich felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. This strange warrior had shown him more kindness in one evening than he had received from his own people in months. "What manner of business, if I may ask?" "The kind that will determine whether your village sees another peaceful day," Ragnar replied cryptically. He reached out and placed one massive hand briefly on Aldrich's shoulder. "Take care of yourself, young Saxon. And remember, strength is not always found in the sword arm. Sometimes the greatest courage is simply enduring another day." With that, the Viking turned and walked back into the night, his figure quickly swallowed by shadows and the remnants of the storm. Aldrich watched until he could no longer make out even the faintest outline of the giant warrior, then retreated to his shelter with the precious remainder of bread clutched to his chest. As he settled into his makeshift bed of straw and rags, Aldrich found himself thinking not of the terrifying stories he had heard about Norse berserkers, but of the unexpected gentleness in pale eyes and the pain of a father who had lost his son. The bread sustained his body through the night, but it was the memory of unlooked-for compassion that warmed his spirit against the cold. Outside, the storm finally exhausted itself, and the first stars began to appear between breaking clouds. Somewhere in the darkness, a lone Viking made his way toward the river and whatever dawn would bring, while in a humble shelter, an orphaned Saxon boy learned that the human heart could hold kindness, even in the darkest of times. Dawn broke grey and sullen over Whitmore, the sky still heavy with the promise of more rain. Aldrich woke to the sound of urgent voices and running feet, sounds that spoke of trouble brewing in the settlement. He clutched the remaining bread from the night before, still hardly believing his encounter with the Viking warrior had been real, and not some fever dream born of hunger and desperation. As he peered from his shelter, the boys saw villagers gathering near the church, their faces etched with worry and fear. Father Dunstan stood on the church steps, his thin frame draped in rough brown robes, gesturing animatedly as he spoke to the crowd. Aldrich crept closer, staying to the shadows as he had learned to do in recent months. "Must prepare our defenses," the priest was saying, his voice high with anxiety. "The sentries report Viking longships on the river, 3 of them flying war banners. They will be here within the hour." A collective gasp rose from the assembled villagers. Women clutched their children closer, while the men fingered crude weapons, farming tools mostly, for Whitmore had no professional warriors among its number. Old Godwin, the village headman, stepped forward, with his walking stick tapping against the cobblestones. "How many ships did the sentries count?" he asked, his weathered face grim. 3, as I said. Perhaps 60 warriors in total, maybe more." Father Dunstan wrung his hands. "We cannot hope to stand against such a force. We must flee, take what we can carry and go where?" interrupted Edith, the baker's wife, her voice sharp with desperation. "The children cannot travel far, and we have nowhere to run. The next settlement is 2 days' march through dangerous country." Aldrich felt his stomach drop as the full implications sank in. Vikings were coming to Whitmore in force, and among them might be Ragnar Ironson, the strange warrior who had shared his bread with a starving Saxon boy, the bread that still filled the boy's belly, given freely by one of the very raiders now approaching their village. The crowd's panic grew as more villagers joined the gathering. Mothers sobbed, children asked frightened questions, and the men formed a tight circle around Godwin and Father Dunstan, speaking in hushed, urgent tones about whatever pitiful defense they might mount. "We could barricade ourselves in the church," suggested Willem the carpenter, his hands already calculating what materials he might use. "The walls are stone, and the door is oak-bound with iron." "And they'll burn us out," Godwin replied grimly. "Vikings are not known for their patience with sieges. Better we—" His words were cut short by the sound of a horn echoing across the river valley, a deep, resonant note that seemed to shake the very air. The villagers fell silent, every face turned toward the sound. In the distance, carried on the morning breeze, came the rhythmic splash of many oars cutting through water. "They come," Father Dunstan whispered, and made the sign of the cross. "May God have mercy on our souls." Aldrich found himself thinking of Ragnar's words from the night before. "I have business to attend to come morning, the kind that will determine whether your village sees another peaceful day." Had the Viking known of this planned attack? Had his kindness been some cruel jest, sharing bread with a boy whose village he intended to raid come dawn? The sound of oars grew steadily closer, accompanied now by the low chanting of Norse voices, a war song that spoke of glory and death in equal measure. Some villagers began to scatter, running for their homes to gather whatever precious belongings they could carry. Others stood frozen with fear, unable to process the approaching disaster. But Aldrich found himself drawn toward the river, compelled by a need to understand. Moving like a ghost through the morning mist, the boy made his way along the familiar paths that led to the water's edge, staying hidden among the reeds and willows that lined the bank. The first longship came into view as it rounded the river's bend, its dragon-proud hull cutting through the grey water with predatory grace. The sight took Aldrich's breath away. He had heard descriptions of Viking ships, but seeing one in person was entirely different. The vessel was perhaps 60 feet long, its oak planks fitted with perfect precision, its single square sail furled to reveal banks of oars, working in perfect unison. Warriors lined the ship's sides, their shields hung along the gunwale in overlapping rows of painted wood and iron. Mail shirts glinted in the pale morning light, and the points of spears and axes created a deadly forest above their heads. At the prow stood a figure Aldrich recognized, even at this distance, Ragnar Ironsson, his massive frame unmistakable even among the other large warriors. The second and third ships followed close behind, each carrying its own complement of hard-faced Norse fighters. The war chant grew louder as they approached the small wooden dock that served Whitmore's fishing boats, and Aldrich could now make out individual words in the foreign tongue, calls to Odin Allfather and Thor the Thunderer, promises of victory and glory. As the first longship bumped against the dock, Aldrich expected to see the Vikings pour ashore in a tide of violence, as the stories always told. Instead, Ragnar raised his hand, and the chanting stopped abruptly. The big warrior vaulted from the ship to the dock with surprising grace for such a large man, but he did not immediately draw his weapon. "People of Whitmore!" His voice boomed across the water, carrying clearly to where the boy hid among the reeds. "I am Ragnar Ironsson, called the Berserker, and these are my sworn brothers. We come not as ravagers, but as men with a proposition." From his hiding place, Aldrich could see confusion on the faces of the Vikings in the boats. Several exchanged glances and muttered words the boy could not catch, but their body language spoke of surprise. This was clearly not what they had expected their leader to say. "Send forth your headman," Ragnar continued. "Let us speak as civilized men, not as wild beasts in the forest." For long moments nothing happened. Then slowly, a small group of figures appeared at the top of the bank, Godwin leaning heavily on his walking stick, Father Dunstan clutching a wooden cross, and behind them several of the village's more prosperous farmers. They descended toward the water with obvious reluctance, every step speaking of men walking to their doom. Godwin halted several yards from where Ragnar stood on the dock, his weathered face set in grim resignation. "I am Godwin, son of Aldwin, headman of this settlement." What proposition do you speak of, Viking?" A slight smile played across Ragnar's bearded features. "A wise man who asks questions before drawing swords. Good, I respect that." He gestured to his ships full of warriors. "You see, before you 60 of the finest fighters from Jorvik and beyond. We could take your village by force within the hour, burn your homes, and claim whatever we wished." The Saxon men tensed, hands moving instinctively toward the simple weapons they carried. Father Dunstan's knuckles were white where he gripped his cross. "But," Ragnar continued, raising his voice so all could hear, "what profit is there in destroying what could instead serve us all? You have fertile lands here, good fishing in the river, and skilled craftsmen among your number. We have strong arms to defend against other raiders, knowledge of trade routes, and silver to pay for what we need." Godwin's eyes narrowed with confusion and suspicion. "You speak of alliance between Saxon and Viking." "I speak of mutual benefit," Ragnar replied. "These lands lie along the river route to York. Other bands of raiders will come, less reasonable men than I. Pay us tribute, accept our protection, and your people will prosper under our shield. Refuse," he shrugged, the gesture somehow more threatening than any shouted threat might have been. "What sort of tribute?" Godwin asked carefully. 1/10 of your harvest, 1/10 of your fish catch, and access to your craftsmen's skills when we have need. In return, no Viking ship will trouble you, and any Saxon force that threatens your settlement will face our axes." The offer sent a murmur through both the Vikings in the boats and the Saxons on the bank. Aldrich could see the calculation in Godwin's eyes, weighing the cost of tribute against the certainty of destruction if they refused. "And if we agree to this arrangement, you give your word you will not harm our people?" "You have the sworn oath of Ragnar Ironsson," the Viking replied solemnly, placing his hand over his heart. "By Thor's hammer and Odin's spear, no warrior under my command will raise weapon against any villager who honors our pact." Father Dunstan stepped forward, his thin face twisted with religious fervor. "We cannot make treaty with pagans. It is an affront to God Almighty. Better we die as Christians than live under heathen protection." Several of the Vikings growled at the priest's words, hands moving to weapon hilts, but Ragnar silenced them with a sharp gesture, his pale eyes fixed on Father Dunstan with unsettling intensity. "Your God teaches mercy and compassion, does he not, priest? Would he have you choose pride over the lives of your flock? I offer peace. Will you answer with war?" From his hiding place in the reeds, Aldrich watched the confrontation with growing dread. He could see the terrible logic of Ragnar's proposal, but also understood the priest's religious objections. The village was caught between competing impossibilities: submit to pagans or face certain destruction. It was then that fate took an unexpected turn. A shout came from one of the other longships, and Aldrich saw a Viking warrior pointing upstream. Following his gaze, the boys spotted what had caught the man's attention: another set of ships approaching, these flying different banners, and crewed by men whose faces were painted with blue woad in the ancient Celtic fashion. "Scots," Ragnar said grimly, his hand now moving to his axe handle, "and by their war paint, they come for battle, not talk." The approaching ships numbered 5, larger than Ragnar's vessels, and crowded with warriors whooping and screaming challenges across the water. At their head stood a massive red-bearded man, whose voice carried clearly over the river. "Ragnar Ironsson, you grow soft in your old age, talking peace with Saxon dogs. Stand aside and let real warriors show you how to claim what you want." The tension on the dock became electric. Ragnar's Vikings were outnumbered, and the Scots had positioned themselves to cut off any retreat downriver. The Saxon villagers found themselves caught between 2 forces of raiders, each more terrible than their worst nightmares. But as Aldrich watched from the reeds, he saw something in Ragnar's stance change. The big Viking's shoulders squared, and his pale eyes took on the cold light of winter stars. When he spoke, his voice carried the promise of violence like thunder before lightning. "Then come, Murdoch Ironarm, come and learn why they call me Berserker." The morning that had begun with the hope of peaceful negotiation was about to explode into the chaos of battle, with the fate of Whitmore hanging in the balance. And in the reeds, a Saxon boy who had shared bread with a Viking warrior found himself hoping that mercy and kindness might somehow triumph over the brutal mathematics of sword and axe. The river erupted into chaos as the 5 Scottish longships closed the distance with Ragnar's smaller force. Murdoch Ironarm's warriors beat their weapons against their shields in a thunderous rhythm, their war cries echoing off the water like the howls of rabid wolves. The Scots had numbers and position. They could trap Ragnar's men against the shore while surrounding them on the water. From his hiding place among the reeds, Aldrich watched with fascination and terror as Ragnar transformed before his eyes. Gone was the gentle giant who had shared bread with a starving child. In his place stood something primal and deadly, a berserker in the truest sense, his pale eyes blazing with the cold fire of impending battle. "Shield wall!" Ragnar roared, his voice cutting through the Scottish war cries. "Form up on the dock! Show these painted fools how real Vikings fight!" His men responded with practiced efficiency, vaulting from their ships onto the narrow wooden dock, with shields raised and spears leveled. The formation was tight and disciplined, each warrior protecting his neighbors with overlapping shields, while spear points bristled like a deadly hedgerow. But Aldrich could see the mathematics were grim. 60 Vikings against at least 100 Scots, with nowhere to retreat. On the river bank, the Saxon villagers stood frozen in terror. They had come expecting to negotiate their surrender to one force of raiders, only to find themselves witnesses to a battle between 2. Godwin clutched his walking stick with white knuckles, while Father Dunstan muttered prayers in Latin, his eyes fixed on the approaching violence. "Get back!" Ragnar shouted over his shoulder to the Saxons. "This is not your fight! Take your people to safety!" But even as he spoke, the boy could see the trap closing. The first Scottish ship rammed against the dock's far end, and blue-painted warriors poured onto the wooden planks with savage enthusiasm. Their leader, Murdoch Ironarm, was a giant even by Celtic standards, nearly as tall as Ragnar, but broader through the chest, his red beard braided with silver rings, and his arms covered in spiral tattoos. "Come then, old wolf!" Murdoch bellowed, hefting a massive warhammer that gleamed wetly in the morning light. "Let us see if the famous berserker still has teeth!" The two forces collided with a sound like breaking thunder. Shield crashed against shield, spear met sword, and the narrow dock became a killing ground where only the strongest would survive. Ragnar's axe swept in deadly arcs, cleaving through Scottish shields and mail as if they were made of parchment. His berserker fury was terrible to behold. He fought like a force of nature, his movements flowing from one killing strike to the next with deadly grace. But the numbers were against him. For every Scots warrior that fell, two more seemed to take his place. The Vikings were being pressed back step by bloody step, their shield wall beginning to bow under the relentless pressure. Some of Ragnar's men had already fallen, their blood staining the dock planks crimson. It was then that Aldrich made a decision that would echo through the rest of his life. Rising from his hiding place in the reeds, the thin Saxon boy cupped his hands to his mouth and shouted with all the strength in his lungs, "The church! The Vikings can retreat to the church! The walls are stone! They can make a stand there!" Every head turned at the unexpected sound of a child's voice cutting through the battle din. Ragnar's pale eyes found Aldrich among the reeds, and for a heartbeat, recognition flickered across the berserker's face. Then understanding dawned, and the big Viking's mouth curved in the ghost of a smile. "You heard the boy?" Ragnar roared to his men. "Fighting retreat to the stone building, move!" The maneuver was executed with the precision of seasoned warriors. The Vikings began pulling back from the dock in good order, their shield wall intact, step by measured step. The Scots pressed forward eagerly, thinking they had broken their enemy's will, only to find themselves channeled into the narrow path that led up from the river toward Whitmore's church. But Murdoch Ironarm was no fool. The Scottish leader saw the tactical shift and snarled his fury. "Burn them out," he commanded his men. "Fire the building! Cook them like pigs in their stone pen!" As the Vikings reached the church steps, Father Dunstan stepped forward with surprising courage, his thin frame blocking the heavy wooden doors. "I cannot allow armed pagans to defile this holy place. You must not—" "Move aside, priest," Ragnar said grimly, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "Your God will forgive the trespass if it saves lives." "I will not." "You will." Adi, the voice that cut through their argument, belonged to Godwin. The old headman hobbled forward, his weathered face set with determination. "Open the doors, father. These Vikings fight to save our village as much as themselves. If the Scots win, they'll butcher us all for sport." The priest's face went white, but he stepped aside as the terrible truth of the headman's words sank in. The church doors swung open, and Ragnar's surviving warriors poured inside, perhaps 40 men now, wounded and weary but still capable of fight. The church of Whitmore was a simple stone structure with thick walls and narrow windows, easily defended if provisions held out. But as Aldrich watched from outside, he could see smoke beginning to rise from the Scottish torches. Murdoch's men were gathering combustible materials, preparing to turn the holy building into a crematorium. "They mean to burn it," Willem the carpenter said in horror, speaking for all the villagers who had gathered to watch the unfolding catastrophe. "They'll burn the church with the Vikings inside." Aldrich felt sick with guilt and fear. His shouted suggestion had saved Ragnar's men from immediate slaughter, but had it only condemned them to a slower, more horrible death? And what would happen to the villagers once the Vikings were eliminated? The boy had heard enough stories to know that Scottish raiders were not known for their mercy towards Saxon settlements. Inside the church, Ragnar positioned his men at the windows and behind overturned pews. The building offered good defensive positions, but it was ultimately a trap. Once the Scots set it alight, the Vikings would have to choose between burning alive or dying on Scottish spears. "My lord," one of the Vikings called out, "they're bringing pitch. They mean to fire the building." Through the narrow windows, they could see Murdoch's men pouring black pitch around the church's foundation, while others prepared torches. The Scottish leader himself stood well back from the building, his massive hammer resting on his shoulder as he watched his trap prepare to close. It was then that something unexpected happened. From among the crowd of terrified Saxon villagers came a small, clear voice that somehow carried over the sounds of preparation for burning. "Wait! Please wait!" Aldrich had stepped forward from the crowd, his thin frame trembling, but his voice steady. Every eye, Scottish, Saxon, and Viking, turned toward the boy. Murdoch Ironarm himself looked down at the child with amused curiosity. "And what would you have me wait for, little Saxon? Speak quickly. My patience burns as short as my torches. The man you seek to kill, he showed kindness to me. Last night in the storm he gave me his last bread when I was starving. He could have passed by, could have taken what little I had, but instead he fed me." Murdoch's scarred face twisted with contempt. "What do I care for Viking charity? The strong take what they will. That is the way of the world." "But that's just it," Aldrich replied, his voice growing stronger. "He was strong enough to take anything he wanted from me, from anyone in this village, but he chose mercy instead. He chose to show kindness to a child who could give him nothing in return." A murmur ran through the Scottish warriors, and Aldrich saw doubt flicker in some of their faces. Even these hardened raiders understood the concept of honor, and the boy's words painted a picture that challenged their assumptions about their enemy. "You speak of pretty words, boy," Murdoch said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "But words don't change the fact that Ragnar Ironsson is my enemy. He has raided lands under my protection, taken tribute that should have been mine." From within the church came Ragnar's voice, clear and strong despite the desperate circumstances. "Then face me man to man, Murdoch. You and I, blade to blade, winner takes all. Or are you afraid the famous Ironarm might break against a true berserker's axe?" The challenge hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Every warrior present, Scottish, Viking, and Saxon, understood the weight of those words. This was the old way, the honorable way, single combat between champions to determine the fate of armies. Murdoch's face darkened with rage, but beneath it, Aldrich could see the calculation. The Scottish leader was brave enough, but he was also practical. Fighting Ragnar one-on-one was a dangerous gamble, especially when he already held all the advantages in the current situation. "Why should I risk single combat when I can burn you out like rats?" Murdoch called back. "You are trapped, outnumbered, and defeated. Surrender now, and I'll grant you warriors' deaths, quick and clean." "Because," came an unexpected voice from behind the Scots, "honor demands it." Every head turned to see Father Dunstan stepping forward, his thin frame somehow radiating authority, despite his obvious fear. The Saxon priest walked directly toward Murdoch Ironarm, stopping just beyond sword's reach. "I have heard tell of your reputation, Scottish lord," Father Dunstan said formally. "They say you are a man of honor, despite your differences with our faith. Prove it now. Face your enemy as a true warrior should, not as a coward who hides behind flames." The insult struck home like a physical blow. Murdoch's hand moved to his weapon, and for a moment Aldrich thought the priest had just signed his own death warrant. But instead of striking, the Scottish leader threw back his head and laughed, a sound like grinding millstones. "A Saxon priest calls me coward? This day grows stranger by the moment." His laughter died, and his eyes grew cold. "Very well. I accept your challenge, Ragnar Ironsson. You and I, hammer against axe, to the death. If you win, my men and I depart these lands and trouble you no more. If I win—" He grinned wolfishly. "Your men surrender, and this village burns." "Agreed," Ragnar's voice boomed from the church. "Clear a space, and let us settle this as our fathers did." As the two forces began to form a circle for the combat, Aldrich found himself holding his breath. Everything now depended on the outcome of single battle between two giants. The Viking, who had shown unexpected kindness to a starving child, and the Scottish raider, who commanded through fear and strength alone. The morning sun broke through the clouds as the champions prepared to face each other, and the boy who had shared bread with a berserker found himself praying to the Christian God for the soul of a pagan warrior. In this moment, the lines between Saxon, Viking, and Scot seemed less important than the fundamental choice between mercy and brutality, between honor and expedience. The fate of Whitmore, and perhaps something larger about the nature of humanity itself, was about to be decided by the clash of steel in the morning light. The morning air grew thick with tension as the two champions circled each other in the makeshift arena formed by Vikings, Scots, and Saxon villagers. Ragnar Ironsson stood with his great axe held easily in both hands, the weapon's steel head catching glints of sunlight that had finally broken through the clouds. Across from him, Murdoch Ironarm hefted his massive warhammer, its bronze head etched with Celtic spirals that seemed to writhe in the light. From his position at the edge of the circle, Aldrich could see the careful way each warrior measured his opponent. These were not berserkers charging blindly into battle, but experienced fighters who understood that a single mistake would mean death. The boy's heart hammered against his ribs as he thought of the bread Ragnar had shared, of the gentleness in those pale eyes when speaking of his lost son. "Ready yourself, old wolf," Murdoch called out, rolling his massive shoulders. "This ends now." "It ends when one of us lies dead," Ragnar replied calmly, his berserker's fury held in check like a leashed hunting hound. "Come then, Ironarm. Show me what strength lies behind all your boasting." The two giants approached each other with the measured pace of stalking predators. Murdoch struck first, his warhammer whistling through the air in a crushing overhand blow that would have shattered stone. But Ragnar was no longer there. The Viking had flowed to one side like water, his axe blade slicing toward the Scot's exposed ribs. Murdoch twisted desperately, the axe head scraping against his mail shirt with a sound like grinding teeth. He spun with the momentum, bringing his hammer around in a horizontal sweep that forced Ragnar to leap backward or lose his legs. The crowd watched in fascination and horror as the two warriors began their deadly dance. Hammer met axe, with ringing crashes that echoed across the settlement, sparks flying where steel struck bronze. Both men were giants among their people, but their fighting styles were completely different. Murdoch relying on overwhelming power and reach, while Ragnar moved with the fluid grace of a much smaller man. "By Thor's hammer," one of the Vikings muttered, "I've never seen the chief move like that." Indeed, there was something almost supernatural about Ragnar's movements. The big man seemed to flow around Murdoch's attacks like smoke, always just beyond the hammer's reach, while his axe blade sought gaps in the Scots' defense. But Ironarm was no easy prey. He had earned his fearsome reputation through countless battles, and his massive reach kept forcing Ragnar back whenever the Viking tried to press an attack. The fight raged for what felt like hours, but could only have been minutes. Both warriors were bleeding now. Ragnar from a glancing blow that had torn his scalp, Murdoch from an axe cut across his sword arm that darkened his sleeve with spreading crimson. Their breathing grew labored, and sweat mixed with blood on their faces. It was then that fate intervened in the form of treachery. As Ragnar stepped back from another hammer blow, his foot came down on a patch of blood-slicked stone, and the Viking's legendary balance finally failed him. He went down hard on one knee, his axe blade dipping toward the ground as he fought to regain his footing. Murdoch saw his chance and took it. The warhammer rose high above his head, poised to crush the kneeling Viking's skull like an eggshell. Victory was within his grasp, and then Aldrich's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Look behind you!" The boy's warning came just as a crossbow bolt sprouted from between Murdoch's shoulder blades. The Scottish leader's eyes went wide with shock and pain, his hammer stroke going wild as he stumbled forward. Behind him, one of his own men, a lean warrior with cold eyes, was already knocking another bolt. "Forgive me, my lord," the archer called out with mock sorrow, "but you were taking too long. Some of us grow weary of your methods." The circle erupted into chaos. Murdoch's betrayal by his own man had violated every code of honor that governed such combats, and the Scottish warriors found themselves divided, some rushing to their fallen leader's aid, others backing the usurper who had struck him down. Steel rang against steel as the Scots turned on each other in bitter civil war. Ragnar hauled himself to his feet, his pale eyes blazing with fury at the dishonor done to what should have been clean combat. His axe took the treacherous archer's head from his shoulders with one clean stroke, but the damage was done. The single combat was ruined, the terms voided by betrayal. "Shield wall!" Ragnar roared to his Vikings, who had poured from the church the moment fighting resumed. "Form up! These oath-breakers die today!" But even as his men moved to obey, the big Viking swayed on his feet. The fall had done more damage than he cared to admit. His left knee was badly twisted, and blood loss from his various wounds was beginning to tell. Around him, Scots and Vikings clashed in a melee that had no structure or honor, just the raw desperation of men fighting for survival. From the edge of the battle, Aldrich watched in growing horror as the careful plan of single combat dissolved into butchery. The Saxon villagers had retreated to what safety they could find, but there was no escape from the violence that now consumed their settlement. Worse, he could see that Ragnar was faltering, the great berserker's strength finally reaching its limits. It was then that something extraordinary happened. Father Dunstan, the same priest who had initially refused entry to pagans, stepped into the battle with a heavy wooden staff in his hands. The cleric was no warrior, but desperation gave him strength as he moved to Ragnar's side. "I may be a man of peace," Father Dunstan called out, parrying a Scottish spear thrust with his staff, "but I will not see honor murdered by treachery." Other villagers began to follow the priest's example. Willem the carpenter appeared with his heavy hammer, Edith the baker's wife wielded a kitchen knife with surprising skill, and even old Godwin hobbled into the fray with his walking stick. They were not warriors, but they were defending their homes against men who had already shown they had no honor. The tide began to turn. Caught between Ragnar's disciplined Vikings and the desperate fury of the Saxon villagers, the Scots found themselves outnumbered and surrounded. The treacherous archer who had started the chaos was already dead, and Murdoch Ironarm lay dying in the mud, the crossbow bolt still protruding from his back. But victory came at a price. Several Vikings had fallen, 3 villagers lay dead or dying, and Ragnar himself was barely standing. The great berserker leaned heavily on his axe handle, his pale eyes still burning with fury, but his massive frame swaying with exhaustion. As the last of the Scottish resistance crumbled, an eerie quiet fell over the battlefield. Smoke drifted from scattered torches, blood soaked into the earth, and the survivors looked around at the carnage with the hollow eyes of those who had seen too much death in too short a time. Murdoch Ironarm, still somehow clinging to life despite the mortal wound in his back, beckoned weakly to Ragnar. The Viking approached cautiously, axe ready despite his own injuries. You fought with honor," Murdoch whispered, blood frothing at his lips. "I'm sorry. My men violated the compact. A warrior's death should be clean." Ragnar knelt beside his fallen enemy, and for a moment his berserker's fury gentled into something approaching compassion. "You fought well, Ironarm. Go to your gods with my respect." Murdoch's eyes found Aldrich in the crowd, and the dying Scot managed a weak smile. The boy who warned you. He has the heart of a warrior." With those words, Murdoch Ironarm died, his eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. Around his body, the surviving Scots knelt in submission, their weapons cast aside, their spirits broken by their leader's death and the treachery that had caused it. Ragnar struggled to his feet, addressing both his own men and the surviving enemies. "Any who wish to sail with me may do so. I can always use brave warriors. Any who prefer to return to your homeland may take one of the smaller ships and go in peace. But know this. The compact your leader made with me stands. These lands are under my protection now." Several of the younger Scots accepted his offer, recognizing strength and honor when they saw it. Others gathered their dead and prepared for the journey home, carrying word that the famous Ironarm had fallen in battle against an even more legendary foe. As the immediate aftermath of battle settled, Ragnar turned to face the Saxon villagers who had helped turn the tide. His pale eyes were thoughtful as he studied their faces, farmers and craftsmen who had taken up arms to defend their homes and their principles. "You fought beside us," he said simply, "Saxon and Viking, Christian and pagan, fighting together against dishonor. That is unusual." Father Dunstan stepped forward, his brown robes torn and blood-stained, but his dignity intact. "You spoke truly when you said strength is not always found in the sword arm. Sometimes courage means standing for what is right, regardless of the cost." Godwin hobbled up beside the priest, his weathered face grave. "The terms you offered before the battle, do they still stand? Protection for tribute? Peace between our peoples?" Ragnar was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the Saxon faces to his own surviving warriors, then to the boy who had warned him of treachery at a crucial moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man making a decision that would echo through history. "The terms stand," he said, "but changed. You fought beside us as brothers in arms. The tribute I ask is not that of conquered people, but of allies. 1/20th of your harvest, not 1/10, and any among your young men who wish to learn the warrior's trade may join my crews and earn their share of whatever glory we find." A murmur ran through both groups at this unprecedented offer. Alliance between Saxon and Viking was almost unheard of, but they had shed blood together, had seen honor triumph over treachery through their combined efforts. "There is wisdom in this," Godwin said slowly. "Our young men grow restless with nothing but farming and fishing to occupy them, and your protection would ensure our children grow up in peace." "Then let it be done," Ragnar replied. He turned to Aldrich, who had remained silent throughout the negotiations, still stunned by the morning's violence and its unexpected resolution. "You boy, you warned me of the archer's treachery. That warning saved not just my life, but the lives of many good men. What would you have as reward?" Aldrich thought of all the things he could ask for: food, shelter, protection, perhaps even adoption into the Viking's household. But when he spoke, his words surprised everyone, including himself. "I want to learn," he said quietly, "to read and write, to understand the laws and customs of different peoples. If Saxon and Viking can fight together, can be allies instead of enemies, then maybe there are other ways the world could be better than it is." Ragnar's scarred face broke into the first genuine smile Aldrich had seen from him. A scholar warrior. Now that would be something new indeed. He looked to Father Dunstan. "Priest, you have learning. Would you teach the boy letters and law?" "Gladly," Father Dunstan replied, "and perhaps he could teach us in return, about seeing beyond old hatreds to new possibilities." As the morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mists that had shrouded the battlefield, the people of Whitmore began the work of binding wounds and burying the dead. Saxon and Viking worked side by side, their old enmities set aside in the face of shared struggle and mutual respect. Ragnar's ships remained moored at the dock, but they no longer represented conquest and terror. Instead, they had become symbols of an unlikely alliance. Proof that enemies could become brothers when honor and courage met in common cause. And at the center of it all stood a Saxon boy who had shared bread with a Viking berserker, and in doing so had helped forge a new understanding between ancient foes. The world was changing, one act of unexpected kindness at a time, and Aldrich found himself eager to see what other wonders might be possible when people chose mercy over vengeance, unity over division. The age of constant warfare between Saxon and Viking was far from over, but in one small settlement beside a muddy river, the seeds of something better had been planted. Whether they would grow into lasting peace remained to be seen, but for now it was enough that they had sprouted at all.